Hey there, and welcome back to Crime Syndicate Stories, the podcast where we map the intersection of crime, power, varying crime syndicates, and sometimes clandestine intelligence operations, and other times just some stuff in between. Now, I'm your host. You can call me Cairo. If you joined us last time, we dove into kind of what was a very brutal reign of a man by the name of Evsei Agron, and he was the first boss of the Russian Mafia in New York, Brighton Beach, Brooklyn to be specific. Today, we're going to turn the page to who would be his successor, a man who would be, Agron's successor, and he traded kind of the bullets and the brute of what Evsei Agron had to something more along the lines of a business acumen. Um, there was maybe a violence, if you will, for white collar crime. But this is the story of Marat Balagula, and doing some reading, he was known as kind of the so-called Russian Tony Soprano after the fact. And you might be wondering what's the connection between an Italian, character within a television show with the Italian mafia to an individual from the former Soviet Union. And honestly, it's just said that he embodied this role of a very powerful and very calculating mob boss, and he bridged the Russian underworld with the American Italian mafia, much like the character of Tony Soprano did. And that character also symbolized kind of the archetypal modern gangster within fiction. But Balagula's nickname, from just some of the readings that I had done, reflected both his leadership style and his reputation for running a sophisticated, criminal enterprise. Particularly thinking about things like the bootleg gasoline schemes while maintaining these ties to major, Italian mafia families within the United States. But in order to better understand Balagula's reign in the Red Mafia in Brighton Beach, we need to understand his roots. We think about his roots, Marat, his name is kind of difficult to pronounce. I don't mean to butcher it. If I have, I apologize. Marat Yagolevich Balagula. And he was born in 1943 in Orenburg, in the former Soviet Union, to Jewish parents who were, fleeing the chaos post World War II. His father was a Red Army lieutenant, and he fought in the final stage, in the final siege of Berlin. Odessa at the time was known for kind of for what's called this, and it's another Russian word, this thriving fartovska, um, meaning informal trading. Informal trading. There was an informal trading scene within Odessa. Many future immigrant mobsters kind of learned the basics of smuggling and arbitrage there. These thieves, Balagula's early life, maybe early texture of his life, shall we say, that's what it was and what he grew up around with, there in Odessa. But by the 1960s, Balagula had found kind of this first stage of the next level of his career. And it was on a cruise ship called the MS Ivan Franko. Now, this ship was a part of the Soviet Five Sisters fleet, which routinely docked in Western ports. Crew members would often engage in small-scale smuggling because Soviet wages were very low, and Western goods were highly profitable back home, on the black market. Officially, on this cruise ship, he was a waiter. Unofficially, he was part of this like shadow economy that thrived in the cracks of the system. Western passengers brought goods, that the Soviet Union folks craved. Things like jeans and electronics and perfume. Balagula learned, how to move these products. He learned how to smuggle, how to barter, and how to build trust in a relative amount of silence. But he wasn't a kingpin yet within his reign there in the former Soviet Union. But he was learning the rules of the game that would kind of help, overall define his life. There's a Jewish immigrant context here. Jewish families in Odessa, they faced systematic discrimination, discrimination in education and employment, and that often pushed a lot of these individuals into, shall we say, informal economies. His youth, though, this was his apprenticeship, not necessarily the lessons that might have been learned in a traditional classroom or in factories, but in his youth and in the corridors of this cruise ship, the Ivan Franko, honestly, where every handshake carried a risk, and every deal also carried a little bit of promise. And this is what built him into who he was so that he could be, set to arriving to America. And he did arrive in America in the mid 1970s, and Brighton Beach was transforming at that time. Between 1975 and 1981, tens of thousands of Soviet Jewish immigrants arrived in New York City, honestly, under refuge resettlement programs. And Brighton Beach became known as Little Odessa. What had once been this kind of quiet stretch within Brooklyn was now known kind of as just this mosaic of Soviet immigrants and all of the culture that they brought along with them. Families arrived with a little bit more than suitcases, carrying memories of maybe scarcity, but I would like to think hope, of survival within a new land as well. And in 1977, Balagula immigrated to the United States and he settled in Brighton Beach. And he quickly became a fixture, if you will, in the Russian, immigrants community there, where in this community they could find places to eat and gather and remember home. But beneath the surface, these establishments were more than just businesses. They were kind of these nodes of maybe a growing, darker network, places where money moved, favors were exchanged, and honestly, probably reputations were built. But he opened places, restaurants and businesses, if you will. He opened businesses where he believed that the Russian community could congregate. One of the restaurants that he opened was called the Odessa restaurant. This restaurant became a staple in the community, and not just for the Russian community, but for the New York City community as well. Some research noted that the restaurant attracted more than just the local community. Brighton Beach in the 1980s was a curiosity filled place for filmmakers because it was kind of very visually distinct and culturally dense and rich. It even attracted Hollywood. It's said that Balagula even turned down the opportunity to have a portion of a movie filmed in his restaurant because he was trying to avoid drawing too much attention to himself. Balagula's refusal to allow filming within, kind of just really fits the pattern of mobsters avoiding unnecessary visibility. This act, it certainly speaks, to who Marat was, right? At least according to a lot of the research that was read. Balagula was different. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He carried himself with a restraint, if you will. He understood that power in Brighton Beach at the time wasn't always or necessarily just about muscle. It was about forming some trust and about being a man who could make things happen, maybe quietly, efficiently, but also without drawing too much attention to oneself. And in the United States, he was no longer just that hustler from that Soviet cruise ship. He was becoming a figure of influence, a man of quiet and steady power, a man whose restaurants and clubs were not only places of comfort, but really just gateways into this overall shadow economy that was taking root, kind of deep root within Brooklyn at the time. Now, with an awful lot of that comes a whole lot of power, right? By the late 1970s, Brighton Beach was no longer just a neighborhood. It was becoming an overall ecosystem, and restaurants and nightclubs and storefronts, they weren't simply just businesses. They were conduits. Money flowed in, favors flowed out. And at the center of all of this was just this growing web that kind of just encircled Marat Balagula. He understood something others maybe didn't at the time, that in order to thrive, yeah, you needed a lot of that trust, but you needed structure, you needed networks, you needed to build some bridges between these immigrant hustlers. And honestly, it was kind of starting to reach some of the larger syndicates that were already entrenched within New York. He began, cultivating relationships with these other crime syndicates, not necessarily with fists, but with a quiet calm and efficiency. And what this brought was he honestly sounds like he offered a whole lot of stability, whereas others within various other crime syndicates might have just offered chaos. He became a man who could kind of guarantee outcomes, whether it was moving goods, laundering money, or maybe even kind of smothering certain disputes. And there was this seat of power. It was not yet an empire, not yet the legend that he became to be, but it was a very strong foundation. A bridge was being built between Brighton Beach's survival economy and this machinery of this concept of organized crime. And how did he do this? There was, kind of maybe like this idea of like the cooperative economy in Brighton Beach. Many immigrants arrived with no English, no formal credit access, informal lending circles, protection networks, the barter system, maybe just inherently without some of the without money or credit access, these things just kind of naturally and maybe organically emerge. It was a very fertile ground, probably, if you really think about it, for organized crime. That this helped pave the way for some of Balagula's earlier successes. Historically he built ties with Jewish American mobsters, the Italian families, especially the Colombo and the Lucchese mafia of the five families, other Soviet immigrant groups as well. These alliances became very pragmatic to him, maybe not always ideological, but certainly pragmatic. As one continues, though, to gain power, uh, kind of keep in mind that all of this is happening in part during the latter part of Evsei Agron's reign. So remember Agron, that first boss of Brighton Beach. Kind of think about the time of Agron being this instability. Agron's reign was marked by extortion and kidnappings, a lot of internal disputes, and many immigrant businessmen just preferred Balagula's calmer, more predictable type of leadership style. Um, in the 1970s, there were several murders tied to rival immigrant factions. Balagula's ability to kind of mediate some of these disputes made him very valuable to both criminals and legitimate business owners. And these several murders were kind of known as the Brighton Beach Wars during the late 1970s. And as we're shifting time, and by the early 1980s, Marat Balagula, he had moved his growing empire beyond Brighton Beach's storefronts. His network was consolidating. Restaurants and clubs were no longer just those gathering places like we talked about, but they were the fronts, the conduits for laundering, for moving money across borders, and for building influence that reached just far beyond Brooklyn, New York. Balagula's restaurant earned him a whole lot of trust. He was seen as reliable, efficient, and discreet, kind of what we had mentioned before. But a lot of consolidation also at times would bring some conflict. Other immigrant hustlers, they wanted their fair share too. Established syndicates, Italian, Jewish, and beyond, they began to notice this quiet man from Orenburg who was just building something much larger than simply survival. When this happens, disputes emerge. Territory, money, reputation. Balagula's strength was not in violence, but in arbitration. He smoothed over disputes, brokered compromises, and positioned himself as indispensable, yet every compromise carried a certain amount of risk, and every deal tied him closer to syndicates whose reach was beyond even Wall Street at the time, and into commodities, and really into this idea of global organized crime. There was this paradox of consolidation. In order to build power, Balagula had to step into conflict. To survive conflict, he had to deepen alliances. So it's a very interesting paradox. But with each step, Brighton Beach's kind of quiet hustler was becoming more and more this strategist within kind of the bounds of organized crime. So all of these things are escalating. It's now the mid 1980s. Marat Balagula's, again, we've talked about, he's no longer just confined to Brighton Beach. His network has expanded, and he's starting to really kind of test the boundaries of that balance, right? And one of his most audacious ventures was the gasoline tax scam. And this feels like what was just a labyrinth of shell companies and paper trails that just siphoned millions of dollars from state coffers. It was kind of really very elegant in terms of its simplicity, but probably very devastating too in terms of its scale, in terms of the impact. And it placed Balagula at the center of a criminal enterprise, really, in Brooklyn, and Wall Street and beyond. And the gasoline tax mechanisms, this scam really exploited an awful lot of loopholes within fuel distribution taxes. These shell companies, or maybe the idea of these kind of being these daisy chains, they would collect taxes and then just disappear before remitting them to the state. And Balagula's operation reportedly siphoned hundreds of millions of dollars. There was some work with other crime syndicates, specifically with the gasoline tax scam. The Italian Mafia involvement is pretty widely documented. The Colombo family, in particular, partnered with Balagula because he could move money efficiently and quietly. Balagula's reach just continued to reach further. There were diamonds from Africa. There were commodities from Europe. There were networks that tied immigrant hustlers to the Italian families, to Jewish syndicates, and just organized crime overall. And he really was kind of stepping out of that comfort zone of just kind of smoothing over disputes in Brighton Beach. And he was quite honestly just brokering deals at this point that was just spanning just multiple continents. Specifically, those diamond and commodities, Soviet immigrant networks that had access to Eastern European suppliers, making Balagula this bridge, if you will, between the East and the West. There was some escalation within that. The moment when when restraint kind of became this empire, when that quiet man from Orenburg was no longer simply surviving, but really just kind of shaping how money flows and how power flows really across the globe. We move in though, if you recall, so Evsei Agron and Balagula is building his empire. But it isn't until May 4th of 1985, if you recall from the previous episode, that Evsei Agron, that man who ruled Brighton Beach through fear, through violence, just this, honestly, through the crackle of his cattle prod, right? Because he stepped into the lobby of his apartment building, Agron did, and a gunman was waiting for him, and he was one shot to the back of the head, and he collapsed instantly. And at that point, the reign of Brighton Beach's first, boss ended with, not necessarily a negotiation, but an execution. And the rumored role for Balagula, there's not necessarily verified evidence that I could find that he ordered the hit, but we can do, like in some of the research, we can note that law enforcement and journalists have long noted that Balagula benefited from Agron's removal. So we could frame it as this idea, right? Investigators did note that Balagula, his rise coincided with Agron's fall, but there's really not a direct link that was necessarily ever proven. Nevertheless, Agron's death left this vacuum, right? And Agron had built this empire on intimidation. But empires built on fear, rarely survive their founder, right? That seems obvious throughout history. Maybe their reign is for a substantial period of time, but they don't necessarily survive long term. Balagula ruled with restraint instead, right? So here he's coming in after Agron's death, and he's this natural choice. He's polished, he's corporate, and he took the foundation that Agron had built, those networks, those tributes, and this seedy kind of shadowy economy, and he transformed it into something larger, something quieter, but something a little bit more enduring. In the aftermath of Agron's assassination, Brighton Beach didn't necessarily descend into chaos. It was just recalibrated. And at the center of this recalibration stood Balagula, the quiet man from Orenburg, and now the undisputed successor to the previous Russian godfather. By the late 1980s, though, Marat Balagula stood at the peak of his power. So he had built so much power even during his predecessor's reign, but it maybe not necessarily having the reign for as long as he could have had it, just based upon his success. Because by the late 1980s, when he was in this peak of this power, that gasoline empire had siphoned these millions. The networks that stretched from Brooklyn to Wall Street to Europe to Africa, all of those worldly powers within organized crime. But we know this, right? In empires, shadows can be fragile, and investigations kind of mounted. And think about the time. Think about how many people within the U.S. government were researching and studying organized crime and going after organized crime. So investigations mounted, indictments loomed, and Balagula's success had certainly drawn attention of the U.S. government, from law enforcement, from rivals, and honestly from allies who saw opportunity at his vulnerability. It didn't take long for the federal pressure to hit, and Balagula succumbed. 1991, 1992, federal indictments and prosecutions began to kind of really dismantle his operations. And as pressure grew, Brighton Beach needed continuity, someone who could inherit again this network, the discipline, the quiet efficiency that had defined his overall reign and into his short time as the Russian godfather. They didn't necessarily need another brute. At least that's not what the organized crime syndicate believed at the time. They didn't need another brute. They didn't need another Agron. They needed someone who understood survival. And that individual's name was Boris Mayfeld. Now, he was not the first, but he was the one who learned from Balagula's mistakes. Where Balagula taught ambition, Mayfeld taught survival, and he stepped into this vacuum, not necessarily with a whole lot of fanfare, but just in order to redefine the game. And that was another part of the handoff, right? From the Russian Godfather to the Quiet One to Balagula's empire to Mayfeld's survival. And again, this story of Brighton Beach just continues to evolve from ambition to endurance and a new empire, and then into adaptation again. Marat Balagula's reign was built on restraint and on networks, on quiet efficiency, and the idea of this overall machinery. But as we kind of hopefully learned throughout the quick discussion here, empires empires tend to have shadows, right? Tend to have shadows that last forever, ever. And investigations came, indictments loomed. Brighton Beach, once recalibrated from Agron under Balagula, was now facing again uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, that's where this new figure emerged with Boris Mayfeld. Not necessarily the architect of the empire, but a custodian maybe of the empire and continuing survival. And that's where the next chapter of our podcast is going to pick up about the Brighton Beach, not necessarily being about expansion, but about adaptation, and how Mayfeld inherited the networks, the discipline, and the silence, and reshaped them into something that could withstand collapse. But that is where Marat Balagula's story does end, but where Boris Mayfeld's story begins. And that's set for the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and taking a little bit of a deeper dive into the Red Mafia. I hope it's piqued your interest. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review if you enjoyed today's episode. But thank you for listening to Crime Syndicate Stories, where we map the intersection of crime, power, and sometimes intelligence clandestine operations.